Jason. Well, welcome, folks. Welcome, I guess, to another webinar. Just thinking back over the past year, all the different things that have come our way through this community group, and not just the steering committee, but the broader group together. Whether it has been different blog posts, presentations at ELI, the virtual brunches, this webinar specifically. There's a lot of things going on right now, and for me, I find a very exciting time to be in this industry of student success analytics. Being able to work in education using data to help keep students at the heart of what we're doing. And none of this, as cliche as it may be, is possible without the engagement of each of you, whether it's attending these webinars, participating in the virtual brunches, the articles that you have written, co-authored, the ones that have been shared through the newsletter. There's just a lot going on. So I want to continue to encourage that. When we talk to other community groups throughout EDUCAUSE, there is a really good example that we're setting. People going, it's impressive, not only the way that membership has grown, but the amount of ways that you are supporting each other in this community. And so we're setting a really nice standard for EDUCAUSE at large and what people expect from a community group. And so I want to continue to encourage that. One way in particular would be with the upcoming survey. It's going to come out in July. There's some questions on there looking for what resources we need, looking for people who want to get involved. This November, we'll have more openings for the steering committee. And so would encourage you to either consider a self-nomination. If there are others on the group who you would like to, or other colleagues who you'd like to nominate, would certainly encourage you to do that. So enough for me. Really excited to pass it over to Kim and Linda for their session today. Off to you two.
Great, thanks, Andy. Okay, so I think as we get started, I guess first we'll introduce ourselves. So I'll go first and then I'll hand it off to Kim. So my name is Linda Fang. I'm a principal software architect at Unicon. We're a consulting firm. We help schools and companies in the education space. I work a lot with integrations and analytics, have a long background in doing all things with student data. I'm really happy to be serving on this steering committee. I've been here for, I guess now, maybe going on 3 years. And I found that it's been a great community with a lot of great discussions. So super happy to have that opportunity. Kim, do you want to go next? Oh, and you're on mute.
Yes, I do, but I had to find my unmute button there. My name is Kim Arnold. I am at UW-Madison, and I serve as the campus lead for learning analytics. Also work closely with data governance and just generally a lot of data-empowered educational practices. So been in this space for 15 years and really excited to be part of this community and to be talking about this today. So I guess, Linda, sorry, am I kicking this off here?
Yeah.
Okay, so sorry, y'all. Fair warning here. I'm headed out on vacation, and so I wasn't probably as best prepared as I should have been today, but here we go. So we are here today basically to talk a little bit about how, as institutions, we can prepare for doing anything in the student success analytics realm. This has become more commonplace over the last 5 years for sure, but this last year, which we've all just lived through in the pandemic, as we are emerging from this weird place that we've been, we find that there's a lot more demand now than previously in a lot of educational circles to have access to data to help support different students. And so we thought it would be really interesting to have a webinar today in which we talk a bit about institutional readiness for student success analytics, and you define that however you do locally at your institution, but also the concept that's closely related to that is organizational capacity. So how do you figure out how ready you are, where you need to put some effort, and then how you grow your capacity as an organization. So before we get started, we do want to just take a brief minute and just learn a little bit about each of you and why you're here today. So what is it that you're hoping to learn today? What challenges are you facing that you maybe want to know a little bit about? And we do have a Padlet, which I believe Linda's going to drop in the chat. And so we just want to pause for a moment and have you add your thoughts to that Padlet. And we're going to come back to some of this at the beginning, just to, I'm sorry, a bit of this at the end. We just really want you to stop and think about, as we start moving through some of the content here, how can you reframe some of what's possibly happening at your institution and take some action from this webinar. So the Padlet link, I think, is over here.
Yeah, so I've just dropped the Padlet link in the chat. And I think if you click on it, everybody should be able to add a card. Feel free to type just using that plus sign to add, or I think if you just double click anywhere in the empty space on the Padlet. Looks like there's a lot of notes coming in now, so that's great. Kim, I think in a few minutes, we'll give everyone a little bit of time. You can click on that link too to share what people are posting in there. Also, if you, as you finish your thoughts, take a look around to see what others have put in. And if you agree or like, you can upvote. I think the thumbs up or thumbs down, or you can even add comments in there. And, you know, I think there's no wrong answer here. So just very interested in what you all want to share here. We've got some great stuff coming in.
So how do I get a new, like a Post-it note to start typing on? It's just moving so fast. Where do I?
Yeah. So if you go to the bottom right, you should see like a plus sign with a circle.
Yeah, okay. Got it.
Click on that.
Thanks.
Yeah. Good to see you, Cal.
Linda, it looks like, are you able to post the Padlet link again for folks that came in late?
Oh, of course. All right, so Kim, maybe we can go through what people have posted in here. I think I saw one that had to do with adoption best practices. I think that's really important because that's partly why this community group exists, is really to have everyone share some of their practices. And I think as a community, we can arrive at what some of the practices are that are considered best, but really it's about what's working for you and what might be harder, and then looking around to your peers and seeing what they're also going through.
Yeah, and I see several on here just trying to explain the value of analytics to different stakeholder groups, trying to drive to action, some exploratory, just trying to see what else is going on. I also love the folks that are trying to expand the pool of interest in analytics outside us data nerds, right? Who just really love this and can geek out on it. So that's awesome.
I like the one that says, where does LA live? And, you know, everyone's responsible, but sometimes no one takes responsibility. And I think that's a very, very cogent point. We'll touch on that a little bit. So.
Definitely. Okay, Great. So thanks for spending a couple minutes there and thinking and kind of helping us ground a bit everybody here just in what we're trying to talk about today. As you can see from the Padlet, there's a really wide variety and really complex issues that are associated with this. And so we do know that you're not going to leave today with all of the answers, right? This is a beginning conversation, and hopefully you will use the community group as a resource, or you might have something to contribute in a future webinar or some resources to put into the hub. So please do make sure you do that in the community group here. I am going to move us along here so that we can get through this presentation and have some time for discussion at the end. So now that we've kind of grounded ourselves in some of the big issues surrounding how do we even get ready, one of the things we want to frame this conversation up with is around institutional readiness. So sometimes it seems like not a super interesting topic when we say, hey, let's talk about analytics readiness. You know, we get a lot of rolled eyes and people just kind of sighing. But it's really important, if you're going to be successful in the analytics realm, that you do some proactive thinking in order to really be, excuse me, to be successful here. And so one of the things we often talk about, I think when you think about a student success analytic, very often people will think of a tool. That will be the very first thing that pops into your head, right? Whether it's a predictive analytic tool, a reporting dashboard, whatever it is. For most people, when you say what comes to mind when you hear student success analytics, it's some type of tool. And one of the things that's really important in thinking about institutional readiness is that we know that successful initiatives are much more than just a tool, right? There's a very complex cultural change effort that has to kind of go into this. And so it's often very tempting to just jump right to the fun stuff, right to the really cool tools. Let's start putting in people's hands. There is a whole kind of cocoon of things around that you really need to consider. And we like to think often.
Kim, just wanted to check in on the screen share. At least I'm still seeing the Padlet. I don't know if others are. Are others seeing?
I am
Yeah.
too. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm seeing the Padlet.
There we go.
Now are we back there?
All set. Yep.
All right. You guys missed our really cool intro slide here. There you go. So there's our institutional readiness slide. And so as we start talking about institutional readiness, we often talk about it as a journey. So this image really resonates with Linda and I, so that's why we're using this, right? So sometimes you see a destination in the future and it can take a bit to get there. So we're going to focus on a few things today because we only have an hour. It's not really enough to do more than scratch the surface. But the big things about institutional readiness and building your capacity are around basically these three big domains. So we'll talk a bit about the technology, and that does include tools, obviously, but also infrastructure. We'll talk a bit about culture and then policy and governance. So we're going to touch on each of these today and try to give you some tips and things to think about as you're starting to get ready and undertake your student success initiatives here.
All right. So I think the first thing as we start thinking about institution goals, around our kind of is, are we ready? And the title of our webinar today was, getting ready. So like Kim said, I think it might be tempting to start diving in with, hey, there's cool tools out there. What can we do with them? But in a sense, the successful projects that I've seen and been involved with have started with a clear articulation of goals. And a lot of this really can also, I guess it's not to say that you need to have the perfect end all be all goal from the get-go. It is really about, what is your organization's process for even coming up with that goal? In a lot of ways, for projects that we've seen, many times groups have started with very small attainable goals, and then evolve those goals over time. But the process of even talking about what do you mean by learning analytics actually can get everyone on the same page and get everybody thinking about what's the right thing that they want to, what's the right first step that they want to take. So the other pieces here are, it's very important as you're getting ready to think through kind of who are the key stakeholders, and do they realize that they are the stakeholders? Many times, I think, as people have stated, even in the opening activity, that there might be key leaders or people who are affected. And in a lot of ways, I think we all know sometimes these initiatives, because of the broad nature of them and the fact that they do go across departments and divisions, it is harder to get off the ground initially. And that is something that we see a lot of. And then the last piece here is to think about what kind of analytics you're doing as you're thinking about, a goal. Is it going to be for looking at student performance? Are you going to be more interested in things like student engagement with materials? Are you looking for kind of instructional design and learning tools and content improvement? And what can be your strategy to help motivate kind of the team that forms with the key stakeholders to go towards some sort of initiative, knowing that many times the first set of analytics, the kind of the menu that you offer for analytics, may not have to be the same today as it is tomorrow. So thanks, Kim. So this is kind of an example of how, some sort of a readiness or planning exercise might be carried out. So in this case, I would say it's important to kind of understand, as with a lot of these journeys, you need to start by thinking about what your organization is like, what aspects of your culture you need to work within, and then even just the sheer, I guess, act of getting the group together in order to think about readiness. This can actually be a good first step in identifying who your stakeholders are and getting them to the table. So this is in the case of a workshop like this that's carried out over the course of about a week. You can do things like, start by doing your goal setting, talk about the organization, and get everyone together to really facilitate open and honest discussions about what people see as the barriers and challenges there. Then go through and talk about technology, and then really, if you think about it, you can come up with some sort of an assessment that has sort of these different aspects to it. So data management might be one, culture might be another. These are all different kind of dimensions of how you might assess your readiness. Policies, and then investment in resources is another key piece. So as we go through and sort of touch on each of these things, know that you may be at some point, and part of, I think, committing as an organization to a specific journey is being open and honest with where you are today, knowing that everyone's on a different journey. And so if you have goals and where you are now, then that's the best way to start mapping out where you want to go from there. So Kim, you can go to the next slide. Okay, so around organizational capacity, this is sort of something that's more thinking about, is the environment ready? Is the, what's going to be the barriers and challenges that you might run into as you think about a new analytics initiative? So, in working with different client projects, I've seen some common patterns where people tend to experience some of the challenges. While some of them are technical, I think the more significant challenges tend to be the organizational ones. So the first one is really about the stakeholder involvement. I think if there isn't any one individual or department that kind of owns analytics, this can make things harder to manage across different departments. And sometimes what I've seen works well is where you have one key stakeholder that they don't necessarily have to be the owner, but they have to be the one who is most affected or most impacted or can have the biggest benefit from an analytics initiative. Sometimes, for example, this can naturally occur. Let's say that there's a new online program that's forming at your institution. That can be a kind of rallying point. So everyone can kind of look to that new program that's forming and look to the lead for that program and see how that person can take them through this new initiative. With this, I think too, whenever people start thinking about some sort of initiative that's going to require a lot of change, there's really, change fatigue is a real thing. So, it's also important to kind of not, to try to work out the timing of this. I think, if schools are kind of in the middle of a giant, SIS migration, that might not be the time, it might lead to some opportunities, but on the other hand, we have to acknowledge that people are already dealing with a huge amount of change stemming from, having to move their SISs. And so, knowing that the anxiety is there for people when there's a lot of change, and being sensitive to that is very important. I think the other thing that's key here, and I think Kim's going to touch on it later, is around data stewardship, right? So knowing that, there are going to be departments that might be the ones collecting the data, but may not actually be the ones who actually are the stewards for that data, then there's no clear gatekeeper. So how do you ensure that there is a designated steward for data that's collected, and there's a process for making sure that other organizations in the institution can get access to that information? All right, so kind of to touch on technology, and again, this is the one that everyone thinks of. It's sort of the key, I guess, water cooler conversation. Most people think of, maybe, is technology or a tool kind of the answer? Well, it's a key part of that answer, and the good infrastructure and planning around that can make a huge difference. But really, there's a lot more to it. And here's where I think that the local context is going to be key. It's important to consider that there's a variety of approaches, and there's always going to be a set of tools that might be good or bad. And one of the, I think, pitfalls is where we might be faced with a product or a set of tools that's presented as, well, they can do everything, or, just put all your data here and you'll just magically have all these amazing views or insights. It's not always the case, although some of the tools can be helpful. But so the key thing here, the takeaway is to really start first by thinking about the questions that you want to ask of your data. And again, it can evolve, but what are the first questions you want answered? And so, if you know what those questions are, then you can go back to looking at what tools might work best to answer those questions. And then ultimately know that, as you go through your technology kind of journey, you may end up refactoring some of your process or infrastructure along the way, and that this is part of the learning process. What I found has worked really well, and schools that I've worked with, have come up with basically like the MVP. What is the first little thing that we want, and can we take that through each of the components in the learning analytics kind of pipeline and architecture, so that we can learn what goes into it. And then from there, it becomes much easier to expand and then grow. All right, last slide. So again, the key thing here is, that there will be a lot of different ways that technology might be brought to bear to answer specific kinds of questions. So the more important conversation is, what are those questions? And don't worry so much about the tool choices. They will naturally come from once you've established what your kind of first set of questions are. All right, so Kim is going to lead us through the next set of key parts here. So she's going to be talking about culture, policy, governance, and ethics.
Indeed, I will. Thanks, Linda. So that really set us up to kind of talk about, that's the type of things that people consider when they start thinking about implementing student success analytics. They think about the technology, the infrastructure. And as Linda said, vitally important. But from our experience, there's a few other things we also want to walk you a bit through today. And one of them is culture. And when I say culture, this is a pretty big and all-encompassing term, and it kind of includes a lot of different things in it, but it's very important to be concurrently considering things in the culture kind of domain as you're thinking through some of the technology issues that Linda just walked us through. So the main point of thinking through culture is so that you can adequately prepare your institution and all the different stakeholder groups within it. So you can adequately prepare them to appropriately use the analytics that will be provided and shown through the tools. And there's a lot of really important things to consider in this domain. We obviously can't talk too much about them today, but we'll have some time for discussion at the end. But a big part of this is just trying to figure out at your institution how you build connections, how you build them across the operational units, against the leadership and strategic units, and how you build them obviously into the teaching and learning and support structure. Cal made this comment in the chat here that student success is really a team sport. And that's the perfect analogy to kind of pull in here. And that's what this consideration, the cultural consideration, is all about, building the connections, because a lot of this is not only building the technical infrastructure and the operational side of the house, but it's also about building trust and accountability, right? And that's with your administrators, but it's also with your students, with your instructors, and with your peers. And so building trust is not something that happens overnight. And it's rarely something that people will just give you inherently, right? You have to earn trust, you have to earn the respect. And so that's where this domain comes in. And it's been, at least in my career, this has been the most critical, right? I have been in many situations where we do get ahead of ourselves. We get really far ahead on the technology, and then we start to kind of hit some bumps, and it's because we didn't pay enough attention to the culture. So we've definitely adjusted that practice, certainly in my institution. And so it's really important to consider that, and to also be thinking about the other frame for our conversation today is organizational capacity, right? So you do need to also be thinking not about just the relationships, the cultural norms and things like that at your institution. You also have to be considering what the people in your organization, what their role is, and how ready they are to receive this, and what kind of support they need. And so, do people have the right skills to interpret the really cool visualizations you're going to give them? Do the support professionals have a really clear idea on how to move forward and take action on what you're showing them? Do instructors and teachers have an understanding of how they can take the data you're giving them and then actually change and improve and optimize their course or their activities, right? And so these are all things that are in this domain that are really important. Training on the technology, yes, but also professional development is very important. And then something that kind of overlays all of this when we're talking about this explosion of data, we have more access, unprecedented demand to this from all levels of the organization, is data literacy, right? And this goes back to, sometimes really smart people can need help in figuring out how to understand what they're looking at. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this. I'm going to pause on that. We'll talk a little bit about this when we get down to the ethics section, because there is an obligation on an institution, if you're providing analytics, that you're helping people appropriately use it and understand it. So this is a really big concept, but I just wanted to put out here, this is a diagram that we often use that can be really helpful, and just kind of at a quick glance can kind of show you how big the concept of culture really is, and that the pace of technology can often kind of outpace where we are. So it's important to look at all of the other facets and just think through the varying levels of buy-in that you might have across campus from different schools and colleges, and actually from just different instructors, from students, from the advising community, anything you can kind of think of. And the importance of thinking through roles and local norms and culture, local practices, not only at the institution, but at more granular levels. So that's kind of the culture stuff. And I'm going to move on quickly, just mindful of time here, to another really big consideration when you're getting ready to undertake a student success analytics initiative, whether it's a small pilot or you're trying to move something to enterprise. One of the things that's becoming more and more important, it's always been important, but let's be honest, a lot of institutions are still trying to kind of sort this out, because the policy and governance side of the house gets really complicated really quickly, especially with the integration of all these new tools in ever expanding digital ecosystems, more and more data coming in for admissions, more and more data coming in on the student support advising side. And so sometimes it's really difficult for policy and governance to just keep up with all these initiatives and all this innovation and just the pure influx of data at people's disposal. So what I'm going to do today is just quickly kind of touch on some main components of the policy governance side of the house, just again to help you start thinking through things and know of things that you might want to consider if you're planning on starting an initiative. So there's the actual ecosystem of data governance. And the way I like to frame it is in a couple little buckets. So the first one is data governance classic. This is the classic data governance. When you think of it, this is establishing policy, making sure they're updated. This is also classifying the data that lives in the ecosystem at your institution, who can have access to it, that type of stuff. So classifying the sensitivity of the data. Obviously, along with that becomes data management plans. How does it get where it's going into the repositories? How is it secure? How long do you have to retain it? All of this very traditional data governance and data management framework. That's a very important foundational element. But then you also have the data stewardship side. And I think we see that in higher education, in education in general, I think, but higher education specifically, we are seeing data governance structures and frameworks maturing and moving more towards more mature data stewardship models, right? Where access paradigms are looking different than they historically have. Data is becoming more democratized, so more and more people are being able to have access to it if they meet certain standards. So data stewardship and how an institution puts this in place, how they secure the data, how they put it into domains. So if you ask for approved access to X data, what does that mean? What's in that pool? Getting that all sorted out, having it clearly articulated and documented is really important when you start thinking about leveraging this data as the asset that it is for an institution. The next part of this ecosystem is also the data use, which is obviously closely connected to the first two chunks of the ecosystem I was talking about. But this comes down to the roles and the approval for people to actually leverage this data, right? So the institution wants to do a new learning analytics pilot. What kind of approvals do they have to make sure that we're abiding by the policy and the framework? Also, along with this is the purpose, right? Everybody probably heard about this and saw it in the news multiple times during the pandemic, right? So what purpose are people able to leverage the data for? And is it going to cause harm to individuals? And that's where the ethics and impact really come in. And that impact is on multiple levels. It's on, excuse me, it's on the use, ethics is certainly on the use of a student. So what's the impact it's going to have on individual students, on groups of students? What's the impact it's going to have on instructors, and on the institution as a whole? So there's multiple levels to kind of consider there. And then obviously at the end of the day, when you're looking at the governance ecosystem for use approval, one of the important things is, okay, what's going to come of this? What's the so what? We're just going to be providing access to data. We want to make sure that we know what's coming out at the other end and that it's within guidelines. So the governance ecosystem is very important to think through and prepare. And often this is the one of the three things we're talking about today. This is the one that can take the longest to do, because traditionally to move a new policy through at most institutions, it takes at least a year, if not longer. And so this is one, again, very important to start thinking of at the beginning of your initiatives along with the tool, so that you can be making iterative steps as you move through. The last thing we're going to talk about today is very closely related to governance and policies, and that is ethics. And it's really important to be considered separately. And I think this has always been the case, but it's become especially more so the case during the pandemic. And so want to spend a little bit of time here, because we know that we, at this point in time, more so than ever before, we definitely have expanded opportunities in the analytics realm, right? We're able to get more holistic views of our students. We're able to see their behaviors better. We're able to have AI help us create intervention engines, and we're able to just support the whole being of a student better, right? Rather than just looking at grade, right? We're able to look across courses. We're able to look across everything they're doing currently in a semester. In a lot of instances, we're starting to be able to look at them, look at how students are behaving, how they're interacting outside of the classroom. So we have a lot of opportunities, but it also means that at institutions, we really have some moral imperatives to take a step back and think about the ethics of our actions, right? And so it's really important, more so now than ever before, that we really do make sure this is a cornerstone in any initiative that we're trying to prepare. So in this talk, for example, we're talking about how to get ready. Let's get ready. So it's really important to us that we have this ethics piece in here. So again, as I've said before, we have an unprecedented demand. We have this explosion of digital learning and other data kind of coming at us. And it's really important that we stop and think. As practitioners, researchers, and educators, we stop and kind of think about this before we get going. And so the moral of this story is that policy is not enough. Policy in a vacuum is not enough. We can't have a policy around data use. So that's where the governance and stuff comes in, without also having the vital component here of ethics. And so we know that there are things happening in the higher education environment, and education, again, just at generally, and this is the other side of the story. This is the stuff that we really need to stop and think about, right? So we have this surge of data, but how does it affect existing tools that we have? For example, most institutions do have some sort of analytics at play somewhere in their institution. This data that's come in over the past year and a half, that's been, most institutions have seen shifts in how we deliver instruction and how we support students, how we interact with peers. and our colleagues. And so all of this data, there's a whole new plethora of it available to folks, and we're getting really excited about it. We want to get into it. But how does that affect potentially algorithms that we already have in place that might trigger or flag an advisor or an instructor to kind of reach out? How might that affect any student-facing analytic solutions we might have in place? These are things to really consider. Also during the pandemic, a couple things we have out here, there were many reports in the news about undisclosed surveillance, privacy violations, just kind of across the board, not to mention gaps in equity that we were seeing come out and things like this, as well as just a general lack of transparency about how data is being used about students. I don't know if anybody has had any conversations with students at your institution recently, or just college students in general. And I think that we're now in an age, especially with traditional college age students, where generally speaking, this is what the research tells us, students do understand that they're being tracked somehow, like some data is being gathered about them. But very few students actually have a really firm understanding of what data is being captured about them and in what kind of context. And in a lot of cases, students are thinking that there's a lot of really scary data being, gathered about them that probably really isn't. And so these are some of the worst case scenarios, but when you start thinking about the ethical use and how you move from some of the literature that really talks about guiding principles, for example, how to ethically use student success analytics, codes of practice, whether that's for researchers or practitioners, educators, whatever. You see a lot of this out there. You see the literature. If you go out and search right now, if you just search ethics and student success analytics or learning analytics, you'll find no fewer than like 100 things that have been written in the last year about this. Very scholarly, very good articles, very good resources I'd encourage you to look at. But one of the tricky things then is moving this from the aspirational into practice, right? And so if you've been part of this community group for a while, you actually know that was the specific theme of a virtual brunch that we did. I don't know. I think maybe last spring,
About a
maybe
year ago. Yeah.
about a year ago. I was going to say, I think it was last spring. So these are things that have been around for a long time. So again, we didn't have too much time to go into detail here, but these are the considerations kind of moving forward. And we are going to have some time for discussion. That's going to be really important. But before we jump into that, we just want you to ground yourself again here. We had the Padlet at the beginning. Now you've heard us talk about some major considerations for getting ready. So just take 2 minutes and just pause and think about what is the one thing that you maybe heard a little bit about today that you want to do a little more research on, or what do you want to take back to your institution about whether it's institutional readiness for student success analytics or building capacity. So it's going to pause for 2 minutes here and just think about that. And if you're comfortable, we'd ask that you would put it in the chat. That's really helpful to us as presenters, and it might help jumpstart some of the conversation as well. Okay. It's been a couple minutes here. So thank you all for stopping and pausing. I think that's really important to just synthesize things that you've just heard, especially when we talk about so many big concepts in such a short time with so little detail, barely scratching the surface. But this type of interaction in the chat and also the Padlet also helps the steering committee look and see what are the big themes that are coming up in the community that we might be able to provide resources around. So thank you for that. So Linda, did you see, I've been trying to watch the chat a bit here, but I haven't seen it all. Is there anything you think that emerged as where we should really focus our discussion to start with?
Yeah, so one thing that came up was really around the kind of how do you get buy-in from key leadership? And I have just to relay, I guess, one situation I've witnessed is where, after an assessment, a group had gone through and really looked at where they were at and kind of concluded that they actually didn't have the buy-in from their leadership and decided to, take a pause. So that's a valuable exercise just to recognize that and then understand what would you want to do as an organization to change that, over time. I think another thing too is as with some of these topics, when it comes to having everyone assess, how our organization is going to tackle something, sometimes that can be overwhelming and maybe, for sure, somewhat uncomfortable. But maybe as a starter to kind of get people warmed up, having discussions in a more abstract. So having a discussion about the topic of data, the topic of student success, and how data might inform that. Maybe think of case studies from other organizations as an example. That can help maybe break the ice. So people are maybe more comfortable talking about something when it's not directly talking about themselves, at least not initially. And I think that's where most people, I think, will naturally in this conversation, as you get into it, start to draw the connections to how you might relate to it as your own organization.
Really great insights. The other thing I just saw scrolling through here, I saw a few people ask about communicating with students and how we do that. And I think that's really important. It's become even more important. I think over the last year, the pandemic has really highlighted the importance of that. Because at the end of the day, we can do as many cool analytics, we can analyze the data, do all the cool methods. But at the end of the day, the central unit there is the student. It's a human being that's at the middle of all of the analytics. And it's really important for an institution to make sure that they are clearly articulating that, right? That we're doing this to support you as a student, and here's what the research tells us. But when you get to the element of actually talking to students and letting them know, here's the data that we're gathering about you, here's how we're using it. There's been laws like GDPR, for example, in the European Union has also catapulted some of these conversations in. And there are lots of conversations about giving students autonomy on what data is gathered / used about them. And again, as with everything we've talked about today, it's a very complex situation. And there have been several efforts, I know, just broadly talking to students and either designing have the students, engage students in co-designing an analytic solution that would help them, for example. There's some really good examples of that. If you look at the Learning Analytics and Knowledge Conference that was in, I don't know, March or April in 2021, there is a lot of really good examples of institutions engaging with a diverse student population and co-designing analytic solutions that supports them. And one of the interesting things there is we often see in the analytics realm that analytics are designed for administrators and instructors and not as much for students. That's only coming kind of into practice now at a very broad level. And so empowering students by giving them access to data about them in the learning environment is definitely a way to start engaging students. But there's multiple levels of ways that you can engage. So at our institution, we try to do some focus groups, talking broadly about privacy, talking broadly about what do you think is acceptable, what data and what do you need? What is the functionality and information that you need? So some thoughts from me. I don't know, Linda, if you have thoughts or anybody.
Yeah, so I was just looking for a link. UBC actually did like a student hackathon a while ago. I think they're doing this maybe more regularly in the last several years to design, like Kim said, how can we better utilize the data out of their Canvas LMS using their APIs.
I'm scrolling back through here. Somebody else said that they have started conversing with students. I forget who that was. Cal, was it you maybe?
Yeah, that was us.
Do you have anything to add to that?
That was us. We rolled out analytics in fall of 2020. And we had an opportunity to go through all the first year seminar classes where we were asked to come and present on our early alerts and the impact it has had on student success. And as a sneak preview, we told them that the analytics was coming. And the way we rolled it out to them was showed them a weather and said, if the weather predicts that it's going to be, raining or snowing, would you just ignore it? Or would your parents not tell you it's going to snow today? So please, wear appropriate clothes. So that's the approach we used. And then we told the students to say, what is it that predicts your success at Syracuse University? What do you think? Then they said, our SAT scores, our high school GPA, our extracurricular activities. So we have started this on a very, very small scale level, because what I'm scared is our student-run newspaper will get some wind and completely distort the whole thing. So we are treading very slowly with the students. And this semester, we are thinking of talking to our student student association, the president and the executive board, to see how best we can roll it. But I was wondering if anybody had any good ideas, because I know the missteps that some other colleges have had and don't want to replicate that. We have had enough problems about other things. This is the last thing I want to mess up on.
Yeah, great points, Cal. Thanks for sharing that.
Can I chime in? I'd kind of build on what Cal said. So I actually shared some reports with students in, it was some learning analytics reports in a class on learning analytics. And so I actually used it as a really cool use case for them to analyze both as themselves, but also from an instructor point of view. These are all educators, and said, what doesn't this tell you? What does it? And for me, it really highlighted that need for data literacy and to be able to put these data in the appropriate context. And a lot of people, even understanding that this was meant as just a discussion piece, really uncomfortable with their data, to some extent, really kind of fostering a fixed mindset as opposed to that growth mindset. All of these are behavioral data too, which to me immediately lends itself to that growth mindset of, these are your behaviors that have led to this. Here's how we can fix it. But that hasn't been the case. So I think there's such value in sharing it with students, but there's so many you have to be very cautious, at least in my experience with that, to make sure that it's placed in the appropriate context for the betterment of student success.
Right. And Andy, because if you mess up, it's hard to get trust back, right? It goes back to that building trust and accountability. And even if you're doing the best you can, if it's something that offends a student, it's really hard to walk that back. So yes, great points. Again, no easy answer. I don't think anybody has figured it out exactly. Lots of people have dabbled and done different things. So we can definitely make sure we provide some resources in the community group, which does lead me to our last slide here. To really encourage you to join the conversation. These are the types of conversations you'll often see pop up in the Slack channel for the Student Success Community Group. So there's a link there to the Slack channel, also to join the actual community group if you have not. Often people find their way to these webinars without being part of the community group. So we'd also really encourage you to do that. It really is not a horrible amount of email. I know people often worry about that, but try to be very respectful of people's inboxes and you don't get too much email from there. So there's your 2 links. We hope that you will join us and continue these conversations, and we can kind of use the community as a way to drive some solutions for some of these more difficult, complicated questions. So that, I want to thank you for joining. I think we're at time, but thank you for joining us and giving us some time today. And please do feel free to reach out to us if you want to have more conversations.